Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. This morning, we'll be joined by Dr. Daniel Henn. Daniel is a PhD student with the LOCAM project based in the University of Limerick and at Salahead Farm, and where he works with James Humphreys and Owen Cashman, who we've had on in recent weeks on the webinar. Owen, you're very welcome. Your topic this morning is the impact of clover and other measures on land use and net zero emissions by 2050. And I suppose net zero emissions by 2015 is the requirement for society and the economy to reach to manage our climate change. But for agriculture, it's a big challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks very much for having me on. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, it's definitely going to be a big challenge. I think I will talk about that quite a little bit. So, yeah.
Your own background? You're not from Limerick?
No, I'm from Germany and have been doing a PhD now since 2021 with James Humphreys at Teagasc Moor Park, and then with David Stiles as well at now the University of Galway. Myself, I'm based at the University of Limerick.
Okay. We're also joined for the questions by Noel. Good morning, Noel.
Morning, Pat. Good morning, Daniel.
Just to remind you that to put your questions and answers in the Q&A, and we'll deal with those when the presentation is finished. So, Daniel, if you're ready to begin your presentation, you might share a screen. And
yep. Thanks very much. All right. So I can hope you see that well.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Great. Thanks a lot. All right. So my presentation today, as Pat mentioned already, will be about the impact of clover along with other measures on land use and net zero emissions from the agriculture by 2050. I have split the presentation into 4 different parts. As we just heard already, the challenge in terms of the climate is massive for the agricultural sector. So I'll start with a little bit of a background. I'll try to keep that quite short. And then we're talking about 3 different things. The national implementation of a grass clover system, as well as defining national net zero scenarios, also including grass clover as one of the mitigation measures. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of net zero metrics in general. So to start off, the challenge that Ireland is facing in the agricultural sector is quite big. It is one of the largest sectors in Ireland. About 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions are from agricultural sector, and in total, about almost 70% of these emissions are from methane, which are related to enteric fermentation of cattle and sheep and manure storage, and then about 1/3, almost the remaining emissions are from nitrous oxide, which is related to manure storage and spreading, as well as the application of inorganic fertilizer. By 2030, we have a emission reduction target within the sector of 25% compared to 2018 baseline, which will be quite a challenge in itself. And then in addition, we have the land use change and forestry sector that is closely related to agriculture as well, where we have additional emissions as of right now coming from drained organic grassland soils, which are mostly used for agricultural production as well, for grazing animals. And we have wetlands as an additional emission source. As a small carbon sink right now, we have the forest land, which is actually decreasing a little bit in terms of its carbon sink due to quite low plantation rates that we've seen in recent years compared to larger ones in the 80s, 90s, up to the early 2000s. And then finally, we have the big target that I'm going to talk about a little bit today, which is to meet net zero emissions across all sectors by 2050. Today specifically, I'll talk about a balance within the agricultural and land use change and forestry sector, called the AFOLU sectors, or agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and how net zero can be achieved within that overlapping sector, I suppose. A little bit more background on the current land utilization in Ireland. So about 60% of the land area, the terrestrial land area, is grassland. And then we have about 11% each for forest land as well as cropland. And then 17% wetlands, the majority of these being unmanaged wetlands, and very small area that is managed, as well as a few percent there for settlements, of course. In terms of land use change that we've seen in recent years, the majority has been dominated by conversions within what would be classified as grassland here. So from livestock rearing towards dairy, driven by the profitability of dairy farms in recent years. And if we're looking into the future, there are a few dynamics and national targets that will require land as well. In terms of agri-food strategies, we have Foodwise 2025, I suppose, and Food Vision 2030, more importantly now, with targets for the agricultural sector and food production. And we have the European Union's nature restoration law, which is not quite finished yet at this stage, as far as my understanding is. But it's likely that this will entail a few unmanaged grasslands as well as unmanaged forests that will be set aside kind of from intensive management. Then we have water quality improvements under the Water Framework Directive, Nitrates Directive. In Ireland, that might be implementation of buffer strips, riparian zones around water bodies. Then we have fossil-free energy production, anaerobic digestion, for example, coming from animal slurry, as well as grass that is being put in there. Solar PVs and wind, to give a few examples. And we have a growing population and cities that are expanding, I suppose, in particular around the bigger cities. I think we all know the development that Dublin has taken in the last years, to give an example. Okay, now I will talk a little bit about the implementation of a grass clover system, and I will keep the things about the grass clover system in itself quite short, just because there have been two presentations that were on from Owen Cashman March the 8th and James Humphreys on March 15th. So if there's more interest in the clover system in itself, I recommend to take a look at these. But what I will talk about here now is that we have collected data apart from the data that is from the Salahead Research Farm, from 39 intensive dairy farms across Ireland that you can see on the left-hand side there on the map, from 2022 and 2023, in terms of the overall annual dry matter production. So what you can see indicated by the different colors there is that there's relatively equal dry matter production across the country, and what we found pretty interesting was that it is quite equal across the different soil groups 1, 2, and 3, as classified by the National Farm Survey as well. Just a few details about the clover system. So usually it has clover content between 23 and 29%, and the mean organic nitrogen fertilizer application was 106 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Keep in mind that this one is ranging from as low as 0, so systems with virtually no nitrogen input, and basically the clover doing all the work in terms of fixing nitrogen and supplying nitrogen to soils, up to the 200. So it's a very diverse mix, going from extremely low to your more conventional input systems, I suppose. And the similar digestibility and crude protein content was observed for this system compared to perennial ryegrass swards. And what this means is, for some of the modeling that you will see in a second, that for which we are using yield response curves. So on the x-axis here, you can see at 0 the amount of dry matter that is produced by grass swards when no nitrogen fertilizer application is applied at all. And then with the growing application, you can see that in these conventional swards, the yield is going up, as you would expect. And these ones are quite close. So the green one here would be a control grasslands from the 39 farms as well, compared to these this yield response curve from Finneran and others from 2012 that was published. So quite close there. But the important thing here is the orange line, and that is the white clover. And what you can see there basically is that the grass clover system decouples grass growth from inorganic nitrogen fertilizer application. So even in systems with almost no inputs, the yields were almost as large, and any additions of nitrogen have not led to an increase in yields. So that is very interesting. And if we upscale that to the national scale, what we've done in this next step, we are looking here at how much of this system is implemented on national grasslands. So the clover proportion in a sward itself is always around 25%, as I mentioned earlier. But how much of this system is deployed to pastures and to silage areas? That's where we assume that it is possible to implement this. So hay and rough grazing have been left on the side, and current production rates or yields there are assumed to remain. And what we see with 0% application of this system right now, we have a baseline of just over 4 million hectares of grassland. And if we increase the proportion of this clover system being used, we can see that the area requirement to feed the current national herd goes down significantly, just because so much more yield is produced, so much more grass is produced, the yield is that much higher, that so much land can be is not required for the current herd, which is very interesting. So there's big potential. And in addition, what we see is there's 3 different nitrogen fertilizer application rates: one at 0, one at 50 kilograms, one at 100 kilograms per hectare. You can see these 3 lines are virtually the same. So there's almost no impact if we apply larger amounts of nitrogen, or if we go with a smaller input system. Then secondly, if we're looking at different livestock sectors, where do these areas or spared areas come from? So we're looking at 3 different farm systems. First of all, dairy. You can see there the dairy system is very intensive, so high fertilizer inputs, and even with the growing proportion of clover, the area is pretty much the same. So that means that the productivity of clover with no input is as effective as a current system with pretty high inputs. And where we can make a big difference in terms of area would be cattle systems and sheep systems, which right now fertilization rates are much lower compared to dairy, which means the yields are also lower. And this clover system, while it requires more attention in terms of reseeding frequency as well as tighter grazing, so it's a little bit more intensively managed, there's great potential to lower the areas that are required there. If we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, just by implementing this clover system once more, no other measures here, we have a baseline of just over 21 million megatons of CO2 equivalents in 2020. And then applying 3 different rates of fertilization, it's possible to lower the emissions by about 10% using the very low input system, compared to basically remaining with current emissions under a system that uses much higher nitrogen fertilization. So that means nitrous oxide emissions can be reduced substantially. Okay, so that was the part about the white clover system. So now I will talk a little bit about implementing that and other measures into national net zero scenarios. And how we've gone about that is by using the Goblin model, which has been developed over the past few years now at University of Limerick, University of Galway. And what it does is it looks at land use, agriculture, as well as other land uses, and it calculates the emissions basically for this sector relevant CO2, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide from the agricultural sector, as well as from grasslands, from croplands, from forestry, and then organic soils, which are connected to all of these land uses. So these are the modeling boundaries for this study. It's a very biophysical approach, so that means that the number of livestock is related directly to the area of grassland that is required, based on the energy calculations of the animals. So how much feed do they require? How much of that comes from grassland? How much nitrogen is then deployed onto grasslands, or to manure storage as well. So it's a biophysical approach, and for this study, the modeling boundaries have been at harvested wood products, and which would be about 1 megaton of emissions currently in the national inventory report, as well as product and energy substitution, which might not necessarily reflect any emission savings within these agricultural or other land use sectors, and more energy, for example, or building construction materials. Okay, so before I go into this, into the different scenarios in itself, I'll talk a little bit about the rationale that we have applied here to come up with these. So there are 3 different levels. The first one is that our target was to maintain current levels of bovine protein production. So considering kind of the pure protein that is produced, meaning that that milk has about a protein content of 3.5%, while beef has a protein content of 23%, and maintaining that within net zero constraints. So there have been some studies in the past that have looked at reducing animal herds, and in this study we've tried to keep the protein output as it is on 2020 levels. In a second step, we are applying 7 different greenhouse gas mitigation aspects, one of them being the grass clover system that I just presented, that are proven to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from livestock production, or are able to create carbon sinks in the land use sector. And then as a third step, the level of ambition of all of these mitigation aspects was set to range from the average current national performance, kind of a baseline based on 2020 as well for the most part, towards what has been proven to be technically achievable based on current studies. Yeah, so this is an ambitious yet conservative approach. Ambitious because we assume, as you will see in a second, a very high adoption rate of these mitigation measures. But it is conservative in the sense that, first of all, we have a time frame until 2050, where, of course, it is extremely difficult to predict anything that is going to happen until then. But secondly, because we're only looking at available measures right now that have been published, and we are not going further, kind of shooting in the sky kind of approach, where we are assuming measures that are not that haven't been proven at to a degree at least. And then just a little bit of definitions for the upcoming scenarios. So when I refer to spared land, what I mean is grassland that is currently under agricultural production for livestock grazing, that is not required under the scenario assumptions. So that means that an improved efficiency, for example, improved grass uptake would lead to spared land rather than further animal stocking, which is one of the assumptions that is critical here. That we can use the spared land for diversification, as you will see in a second when I talk about the scenarios. And then finally, for this first exercise, we're using a GWP 100 net zero definition, where all gases require offsetting by 2050. And what that means, I will talk about a little bit later when I'm going into the 4th chapter, I suppose, of this presentation. So about the scenario development, 7 different mitigation measures, as I mentioned. First one being livestock profile and productivity. So in the baseline assumption here at the top left, we have used the 2020 cattle herd and the 2020 sheep flock, as well as the 2020 dairy cow productivity at about 14.85 liters per day. Then we have ambition 1, which maintains the protein outputs from 2020, as I said, and we have an increase in dairy cows and a decrease in beef cows, as well as a 20% decrease in the sheep flock, and a slight increase in the productivity of dairy cows. And then finally, we have one more scenario where dairy cow numbers decrease as well compared to the present, and we have an increase of dairy cow productivity, which we have assumed to be 1% on average per year between 2025 and 2050. So that would then leave us at 19.2 liters per day for this ambition. And we're looking at livestock management. So the mean slaughter ages and weights, and in the baseline we are taking the ones from 2020. In ambition 1 and ambition 2, we assume that slaughter weights remain the same, but slaughter age decreases by 2 days on average between 2025 and 2050, so 50 days in total for ambition 1, and 4 days per year on average, so 100 days in total for ambition 2. The third one would be the grass and sward composition. So this is the clover system that I've talked about earlier. In the baseline, we assume that 100% of the swards are these perennial ryegrass swards, which I suppose doesn't mean that there can't be a small percentage of white clover per se, but it is not the dedicated system that I've talked about earlier, and that was introduced a few weeks ago by Owen Cashman as well. And then we have 2 different ambitions. First one being 50% implementation of the white clover system, second one being 75% without any inorganic nitrogen fertilizer. For the fertilizer that is remaining, we assume that this is spread as protected urea. So in ambition 1, 50% of that is actually protected urea, and in ambition 2, 100% of applied fertilizer. In terms of the grass-induced efficiency, so how much of the grass actually gets taken up by the animals, our Goblin model suggests that the 2020 values there are 72% on dairy farms and 55% on beef farms. And for the ambitions 1 and 2, we have ambition 1, we have a small increase on dairy farms and a 5% increase on beef farms. And then for ambition 2, we have another 5% increase on beef farms to close the gap towards dairy farms. Then we're looking at afforestation, and these are not so much about the baseline or different ambitions. I suppose it's more about strategies of the afforestation mix. So first one, we have 75% deciduous trees and 25% coniferous trees with 15% thinning. Then we have a 50-50 split, and then finally vice versa, 75% coniferous and 25% deciduous trees. The final one there is methane inhibition. So we have 0% as our baseline. Then we have 15% of enteric fermentation and 5% of manure management. That is that emissions are reduced. And for ambition 2, we have 30% of enteric fermentation and 10% of manure management. In terms of organic soils, we have 90% rewetting of organic soils that are currently utilized for livestock production and 90% reduction of wetland emissions. And with this, I explained the concept of the spared grassland a minute ago there. We assumed that 50% of this will go towards grasslands with a priority of rewetting these organic soils to reduce emissions in the first place. And then we have 50% going that are available for forestry. And anything that goes beyond the available organic soils for rewetting, that remains as grassland, we assume that it's available for some of the other challenges that will require land that I talked about there in the beginning. So in total, this means that we have 3 to the power of 7 scenarios, which are 2,187 in total. And what this figure shows you is how much of these are actually below below zero. So these are the net zero scenarios below this line, which ended up being 122 out of these just over 2,000, which is about 6%, which is not that many considering the amount of mitigation measures that we have implemented there. And one of the important things that you can see here is that the scenario that achieves net zero, that is furthest to your right there, requires about at least 1.4 million hectares of land sparing. So you can imagine 700,000 of these would be going towards forestry, 700,000 of these would be going towards grassland and wetland restoration. So next up, I will be ranking the mitigation aspects in terms of how effective they were. So first of all, the afforestation strategy is very important, because actually only scenarios here in ambition 2, which was 75% coniferous trees in the afforestation mix, achieved net zero. So it's very it had a great impact on the result. What kind of afforestation is applied. Secondly, looking at the livestock herd profile, we can see that the current herd configuration, the 2020 baseline there, doesn't achieve net zero under any of the scenarios. And basically, what is required are some of the changes that I outlined there a second ago, with larger productivity of dairy and a reduction of beef cattle. In terms of methane inhibitors, they were the third most important measure. Then followed by the grass and sward composition, so our grass clover system, which combined an emission reduction, as I showed earlier, from displacing fertilizer application and therefore nitrous oxide emissions, while also sparing land. And at the bottom there, you can see that protected urea and reducing the slaughter ages had the smallest impact on the scenarios. With protected urea, it has to be said that in all the scenarios where clover is applied, of course, the application of fertilizer is so much lower in the first place. So that means that the potential of protected urea gradually goes down with that as well at the same time. So to give one example of an emission configuration for net zero, so the picture on the left hand side is what I showed to you earlier. We have just over 20 megatons of CO2 emissions from the agricultural sector. Then wetlands and grasslands making up about 7 megatons, and we have forest land as a sink. And for 2050, this for the net zero scenarios, first of all, the agricultural emissions are reduced substantially. Then 90% of the emissions here from land use are mitigated, while the sink from forest land is becoming substantially larger. Okay, so much for the first part of that net zero analysis. Now we'll talk a little bit about net zero metrics, and these are very important for a number of reasons. First of all, what is currently used for international climate impact accounting under the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change assumptions, is GWP 100, which assumes that carbon dioxide has carbon dioxide equivalent, methane has 28, and nitrous oxide has 265 carbon dioxide equivalents. So that reflects kind of the global warming potential of each of these gases under the AR5 reporting, that is. And GWP 100, as the name suggests, uses a 100-year time frame, which has a few impacts on the different gases. So while CO2 and nitrous oxide have a lasting and long-term climate impact, this is different for methane because it has a stronger impact in the short term, but not so much in the long term. And this is very relevant I showed you that about 70% of the emissions in the agricultural sector in Ireland are from methane. So it's very relevant for countries with large livestock sectors, such as Ireland, such as New Zealand, and others. Therefore, there are alternative metrics such as GWP star, which some of you may have heard about, which use a different approach with the aim to reflect a different timescale of methane. And what kind of an impact this accounting measure has on agricultural activity has been shown by a study that was recently published by George Bishop and others. And while this figure looks might look very haunting in the first place, what you can see here at the top right of each of these figures, which represent different global warming potential metrics, is the current population of dairy cows, so just under 1.6 million, and the beef population of just under 1 million here. And this one shows which animal configurations can achieve net zero. So if a large proportion of the dairy animals are kept there, the majority of beef population would have to be reduced under this GWP 100 configuration. For GWP star, for example, this one is much different because there's methane is treated differently, as I mentioned. So that means that the number of livestock that can be maintained under these net zero assumptions for this definition are a bit different. And then you can see methane is one that is can be treated very differently as well. For example, grandparing, that is one approach that is based on historical emissions in a country. So that means that Ireland kind of has a historically quite large livestock production. So that means the allowances are quite big. Versus then there's one, for example, that is based on the population. And of course, the Irish agricultural sector is quite large compared to the population of the country. So that would mean, extremely different results. Basically, what I'm trying.
Hello, Noel, are you there, or is it me who's being cut off?
Yeah, no, I'm still there. I think Daniel is being cut off
Okay,
there.
back. Sorry about that, folks. Daniel, we lost you there for a second. If you want to just go back about 30 seconds.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
So yeah, maybe I won't go into too much detail on this one. But the point is, as you can see here, in terms of the animals that are considered sustainable within a net zero range very different, or there's a very broad range of animals that are considered that within different definitions of net zero. So that's really the point of this one. And for our study here, we are looking at definitions within GWP 100. So the Paris Agreement and a few other global climate stabilization models state that CO2 emissions need to be completely offset by 2050. So if we're looking at the agricultural sector, that is not much of an issue, just because virtually no emissions are in the form of CO2. But then for nitrous oxide, models are suggesting that we require a complete offsetting by 2070 instead of 2050. And for methane, that there are significant reductions by 2050, but not a complete offsetting as well. Which means that for the following results, we have used 4 different net zero definitions within GWP 100. So the first one, and these were all the results that I just showed, are all gases are offset by 2050. Then we have CO2 and CH4 offset by 2050, while N2O is offset by 2070. One that uses CO2 offsetting by 2050, and then 32% of CH4 that is offset by 2050, and N2O completely by 2070. And finally, CO2 offset by 2050, and methane and nitrous oxide by 2070. So that these are 4 different net zero definitions. We have combined this one with 3 levels of annual afforestation that are achieved in Ireland, to see how that impacts successful net zero scenarios. So first of all, we have 8,000 hectares per year, which is the rate that is suggested in the climate action plan right now. Then we have 24,000 hectares, which is the maximum that has been achieved in Ireland historically in the 90s. And then we have no limitation. The only limitation is the modeling that the modeling boundary that I explained earlier, which would be 50% of all spared land. And where that leaves us is here at the top left. You can see these are the 122 successful net zero scenarios that I explained earlier, using the definition where everything is set up by 2050. And interestingly, these are not achieved with annual afforestation rates now between 2025 and 2050 of anything less than 24,000 hectares. If the definition is changed slightly towards 2070 offsetting of nitrous oxide, the amount of successful scenarios in total is about threefolded there. And with less than 24,000 hectares per year, net zero can be achieved. If we're looking at a definition where only 32% of methane needs to be offset, as you can imagine, a lot more scenarios are successful. But there's still a difference between the 8,000 hectares annually and the 24,000 hectares annually. And then in the final definition, where methane and nitrous oxide need to be offset by 2070, the majority of scenarios is successful if at least 24,000 hectares are, if at least 8,000 hectares actually are afforested every year. But then once we go below 8,000 hectares, the proportion reduces substantially. Okay, so getting very off the time here. I'll come to some of the conclusions. So what this study and some recent ones have shown is that there are 2 pathways for the FOLU sector towards net zero. The first one, and this is some of the things that I've presented here today, is that one pathway is to intensify the land use, both for agriculture, especially for dairy, and for forestry, and maintaining current levels of protein production. And the second one is extensifying, the land use, which means that agricultural activity would be reduced strongly while deploying some afforestation, not to the levels that I've shown here, but at the same time there would be substantial losses in terms of protein production. Secondly, grass clover was shown to be a very important measure that combines emission reductions with the land sparing as well, while also contributing to ammonia reduction targets, which I haven't gotten into too much detail here today, but also connected to nitrous, reductions of nitrogen fertilizer applications. And then finally, the national net zero definitions need to reflect the physical warming properties of gas. So methane is more short-term, the other ones are more long-term, but at the same time be robust to scrutiny on international fairness. So meaning that I suppose there's a lot of debate going on whether like these historical emissions are more important, what should be considered sustainable in that context. Because we've seen that there's a strong impact from these metrics. Current livestock herd configuration doesn't achieve net zero under most of these net zero definitions that we've seen here. Substantial technical abatement measures are still required. You've seen very, very high uptake rates of all of these mitigation measures. And then finally, afforestation rates that are much larger than presently achieved are required under virtually all of these definitions as well. So finally, some of the limitations, of course, I'm sure we'll get into some of these in the discussion now. The modeling limitations, first of all, the grass clover system was applied on dairy farms. So there are questions on how scalable it is for other farm types, but of course also to a national context in general. And then finally, we have harvested wood products and substitution effects that are not included. And especially if we're looking at substantial increases in the forest land, that means also more forest management. So also a higher potential for additional storage of carbon in, for example, in housing and other harvested wood products as well. And then finally, this has been a biophysical study that is looking at the impact on net zero scenarios. So of course, this is not the golden solution for everything. So what is the impact of these scenarios on socioeconomic factors, the rural population? I think you can tell from these scenarios there's substantial structural change that would be required to implement anything like this. What would be the effects on the population? What about water quality? Like we're looking at systems that are more intensively. Is there a way to kind of mitigate some of the potentially negative water quality effects from more intensive land management compared to right now? And of course, what about other targets that require land, such as water bioeconomy targets, for example, anaerobic digestion, as well as other green energy production? Yeah, so maybe to conclude in general, addressing these issues will require long-term integrated analysis. So some of the things that we have kind of started here and we're looking to expand in the future, taking a lot more factors into account, and policy coordination across sectors. Because this analysis is across sectors as well, not purely in the agricultural or the land use one. Thanks very much for your attention and to all co-authors, contributors, and also to Dafn. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That's really interesting, really complex, and I think it gives plenty of food for thought, if you pardon the pun. Just to remind you, if you have questions, to put them into the Q&A. Just, I suppose, a couple of questions there. In terms of, I suppose, one general sense I got from the presentation is that there is potential for approaching net zero without total fundamental change in our systems of production, but with very substantial changes in how we do our job. Is that a fair conclusion?
Yes.
If you wanted to
Yes and no, I would say, because I think especially for the more extensive production systems right now, what these scenarios really show is that the way that these pathways work is that there's either intensive farming or intensive forestry. So it's kind of a deployment of either of the two. So that's one important thing. So of course, I think thinking about farm structure in general, I think you can't deny that this would have some impacts.
Yeah. The question in relation to the contribution of agriculture, of land, if you want, to the energy generation, we're not, am I right in saying that that's not kind of credited to agriculture, that's credited outside of agriculture?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so some of the things, as well as the substitution effects that I kind of mentioned as one of the modeling boundaries that we have right now, even though they are related to the land sector, and of course in forestry there are like carbon sequestration is being achieved that is directly relevant for this sector. For example, this has the potential to displace some of the concrete, some of the other like fossil fuel energies. So those will be relevant for these sectors. Yeah. So that's why it's like in a perfect world, of course, there would be some kind of mechanism between these sectors. But I think right now that is very difficult.
And I suppose you put out a kind of a timeline and a possibility for the 3 individual gases and how we get to net zero in each one. I can get my head around 2 of them, but not the nitrous oxide. In an agricultural context, I can see we can sequester carbon we can or we can stop carbon coming out of some of our soils. We can sequester so I can see the CO2 one. The methane, particularly if we move to with the nature of it dissipating or disappearing over a period of time, that if we reduce, we can see reductions there. But nitrous oxide is long lasting and will continue, or is likely to continue to be there from agriculture. So I find it very difficult to see how we will get to a position of neutrality on nitrous oxide.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think these obviously there's some flaws in this greenhouse gas accounting, because each of these gases behaves very differently, as you mentioned there. I think the CO2 equivalents in terms of just because CO2 and nitrous oxide, I think they behave more similar at least than your methane on the other hand. So I think the way to approach this is to use these equivalents and try to get to a balance as good as possible. I don't think I can give you a much better answer there right now.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Noel, good few questions coming in.
Yeah, I suppose the concept of the spared land. Yeah, so I suppose you kind of outlined a scenario there, maybe where by using clover you could generate more spared land out of that, and other scenarios. But I suppose that have you any thoughts on how we might actually package that to make it attractive for farmers to use the spared land in the kind of the scenario that you suggested there? Or
yeah, no, I mean that's the big hurdle, isn't there? Like one of the assumptions that I mentioned is obviously we're talking about national averages, national aggregates here. So it's very easy to put the numbers on paper for a national level, but actually how to achieve these, how to get kind of a transformation, a diversification of land use, how to make that attractive is a very good question. One of the important things I think will be to consider that other things get an economic value placed on them other than agricultural production. I think right now we talk a lot about biodiversity, for example, but it is very underrepresented in terms of its economic value. When I think a lot of people are, there's a lot of intrinsic value in it itself, and I think one of the things that needs to be slightly changed is how each of these things are valued, both in our minds, if you will, but also economically, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. And there was just a question in a kind of very specific one now, but I'll read it out word for word because it's a good question. Does results infer the minimum of 1.4 million hectares land spared on an annual basis for 2050 to achieve net zero 2020 at a 2020 baseline, or what additional amount will be needed annually beyond 2050 to retain net zero as sequestration ability reduces from forestry? So it's I suppose I think what they're saying there is the results infer 1.4 million hectares of spared land on an annual basis from 2050 to achieve the net zero baseline. But then beyond that, when sequestration reduces from forestry, is there more land needed beyond that?
So you're basically talking about the time past 2050 to maintain the net zero. Am I getting that right? Yeah,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point. One of the things that was actually shown in the study by George Bishop and others that I quickly mentioned there. They're looking at a time period from 2050 to 2100 as well, and what it takes to maintain that. I think it's a question of the forestry, but and like what different rates are, how we can manage these going past 2050. But I think there will be this won't be necessarily the end of land that would be required. But it won't be as dramatic as the 1.4 million hectares, that's for sure as well. So I wouldn't say that it's that this is the ultimate resolution for the time past 2050, but yeah, much less. And keep in mind that what I mentioned about the conservative yet ambitious approach kind of that we've chosen here. The forestry is a solution right now that is more or less the only solution that we have to generate large-scale carbon dioxide removals. You know, but if this is not something that we start right now, and there won't be other technical solutions becoming available by 2050, the time is kind of running out. At the same time, past 2050, I'm sure a lot of people are very positive that there will be other solutions as well that could be implemented that would have an impact on land use and how much is required.
And I suppose just a very quick question, and maybe from an information point of view, you were mentioning about the 75% conifers ranking highest, and the question is why or how do conifers outperform deciduous trees?
Basically, the growth rates and the yields kind of that can be achieved from conifers. I mean, the climate here in Ireland is ideal for farming, but I have to say it's also ideal for forestry. Some people underestimate that. I used to live in Sweden and worked a bit there for forestry, and there they were assuming that the perfect kind of tree rotation is about 100 years, 120 years if you go a bit more north. Here we're talking about 40 years, so it's 2.5 the speed, if you will, that carbon can be sequestered there. So I think people tend to underestimate that potential a little bit as well. And yeah, while I personally think that like coniferous monoculture in a way is not the solution, and of course there needs to be a fair mix. The potential of purely for carbon sequestration is larger from the coniferous ones.
And maybe one final one from me, Pat, before I hand back to you. Just around the clover and like all land type is not the same. I think you referenced at the very start of your presentation about the results you had from the farms you were surveying in the research, but not all land type is the same. And will clover output be across all land types? And maybe the answer might be around the management of it then, based on the land types, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I mean, the management is the key, I think, just because it takes that little more, at least from what I've learned from the presentations from James and Owen as well, what they have seen in Salahead. I mean, the management is really where it's at in terms of getting the system to run, and well, it requires a little bit more reseeding. If I'm pretty sure that they are assuming that about 10% of the annual land would be reseeded, and there's slightly lower yields achieved there. But in terms of different soils and their impact on the system, of the 39 farms, I can't tell you the exact figures, but give or take, 15 of them were on what would be classified as soil group 1, 20 were on soil group 2, and about 4 or 5 were on soil group 3. And there was actually no difference between the averages, like absolutely no difference between the soil groups. So that's what we found quite interesting as well.
Yeah, so the suggestion was that we focus clover on the better land and forestry on the poorer land, but maybe that doesn't ring true or hold true for clover production.
I think, well, for clover reduction, I guess it rings true in a way, but it can also be expanded, that's for sure. But for forestry as well, I think obviously the prime land is extremely interesting for agriculture. There's no denying that. But of course, if we're looking at forestry, like there's also vast differences in productivity between the different types, and soil group 1 to 3, what can be achieved there. So it's definitely something to consider for all of them as well. But yeah, I fully understand everyone who's a bit skeptical about putting trees on their prime dairy land.
Pat?
Okay, yeah, no questions. One in relation to why is nitrogen fixed by clover less likely to deliver nitrous oxide emissions than chemical nitrogen? Or, well, I suppose the first question is that the case? And then what's the logic behind it?
From what we've seen, it is the case, and I think it's because the distribution is just well, the kind of the runoff is eliminated a little bit. I'm not. I have to say I'm not. This is not my deepest area of expertise, but the way I understand is that the nitrogen kind of is deployed at the root level, and it's much easier to be contributed to all the the other grass around it as well, other plants from root to root, compared to some of the nitrogen fertilizer that is obviously applied to the top of the soil, and then runoff as well as the pathway towards the roots is kind of where some of the things are lost.
A question there in relation to the potential impact of climate change impacts on it's almost what spreadsheet users might refer to as a circular reference, that you have to build in climate change into it. Has that been done, or have you had any shot at that?
So far it hasn't, no. So in terms of the productivity, for example, of grass, that's obviously one of the main factors that would impact. We're looking at what is currently achieved, and that's certainly one of the constraints, if you will. I suppose it's difficult just because
even the computers wouldn't like it.
Well, even not necessarily that. I think I'm not sure if I'm sure there's areas in the world that would be much more affected than Ireland. So I think in that terms, I think it's probably a smaller impact here compared to many other regions. But estimating that I think is so difficult, and kind of implementing that into a model that is based on the past in a way, taking this very future-looking approach. It is extremely interesting. Don't get me wrong, but it will be difficult to come up with numbers for the grass in the future, where we have no idea pretty much.
The recent changes that we've heard about, Pat Toohey was talking about the recent changes in the peatland emissions. And I think there's been a recent upping of the wetland. It strikes me that you have put in 90% reduction in wetland emissions.
Yeah.
What has to happen to achieve that? Because is my understanding correctly that a lot of those are not they're managed at a very low level?
Yeah, exactly. So these are kind of from our spared land approach, if you will. We have prioritized these soils that are more organic, and try to re-wet them in the first place. And then obviously there's a period of time to where that it takes until emissions are lower. And I think there's a lot of discussion about what this time frame actually is. Okay. But I think you can argue that we were very optimistic in our assumptions to get a 90% reduction there.
Okay. Listen, we're out of time. It's 10:29. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Really interesting. But I suppose it's opening up the possibility that maybe carbon zero is a possibility for agriculture, and that's a space, I suppose, that we would have kind of assumed was not possible. So we may not ever get there, but getting close to it would be a huge achievement. So
definitely, yeah. And I think the more and more research that is done on this, there will be more pathways kind of combining this one. This one was very focused on net zero, obviously. Yeah. There's other things that are extremely relevant in terms of targets. So I think there's interesting things to come.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. Really appreciate it. Thanks to Noel. Thanks to Mary, who has helped us in the background. Next week, we'll be joined by Paula Carney. Paula is the Biodiversity Officer with Galway City Council, and she'll be talking about the Buile Bow project in Ballyloughnane, where they're using Irish dexters to manage a very sensitive habitat. I'm not from Galway, Noel. I saw you smiling at my pronunciations there, so apologies to all I might have offended. So listen, enjoy your weekend. Hopefully it'll be fine for everybody, and goodbye. We'll see you next week.